Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder if the way we do research across different cultures is really fair and accurate? Well, this new paper dives deep into that very question. So imagine we're testing how well people remember things or solve problems. We use special tests for this, right? But what if those tests were created in one country, say America, and then we try to use them in a completely different country, like in South Africa or Thailand? Do those tests work the same way for everyone? Do they measure the same things? This is the big puzzle the researchers in this paper, Wyhe, Rakshasa-Loots, and Thomas are trying to solve. They start by pointing out a pretty serious problem. There was a study published that had to be taken back, a retraction, because it had major issues with how it handled cultural differences. The authors of this new paper say that this wasn't just a small mistake, it showed a real lack of understanding about how to do research fairly across cultures. This really highlights why we need better rules or guidelines for this kind of research. And it is not just one bad study. They tell us that in many places, especially in places like Southern Africa, researchers often use tests that were made somewhere else. In countries like those in Europe or North America, they rarely use tools that were actually made and tested in those local communities. This means that the people who are most affected by these tests have had little say in how they are made or used. That doesn't sound very fair, does it? Now, there are some existing guides that try to help with this, like guidelines for translating tests and others for being culturally aware. But the authors of this paper feel that these guides are not complete. They cover some parts of research, like how to translate a test, but they miss other really important steps, especially from the very beginning of planning a study all the way to sharing the results. They say these existing guidelines leave big gaps, particularly for researchers working in places that are not in Western countries. So what did they do about it? They created something called the Accent Checklist. Think of it as a helpful to-do list, a guide for researchers to make sure they are doing their cross-cultural studies in a way that is ethical, smart, and respectful of different cultures. It is designed to cover the whole process, from the initial idea to sharing what they found. How did they build this checklist? They did a lot of reading, looking at all the existing research and guidelines. They also brought in their own experiences, doing this kind of research in places like South Africa and other parts of the global South. They combined what the experts have written with what they've learned from actually doing the work on the ground. They narrowed it down to 6 main areas that need special attention. First, who is on the research team? Is it a diverse team with people who understand the local culture? Second, how do they work with the community where the research is happening? Are they just taking information, or are they truly collaborating? Third, how do they design the study so that the comparisons they make are fair across cultures? How do they choose and adapt the tests they use? Fifth, do the people doing the research get trained to be culturally sensitive? And finally, how clearly and openly do they share their methods and their results? Let's break down the checklist. Section A is all about the team. Item A says there should be at least one person on the team who is from that region or has spent a lot of time there. This person should know the local culture, the language nuances, how people go to school, and the different economic situations. This is super important because they can help avoid mistakes and make sure the study makes sense in that specific place. Item AI says you definitely need a neuropsychologist on the team, someone who understands how to give these tests, what normal performance looks like in different groups, and how things like age, education, and where you live can affect brain test results. This is crucial for making sure the findings are interpreted correctly and not just misinterpreted due to lack of understanding. Section B is really interesting. It's about working with the community. Item B1 says there needs to be proof that the researchers actually talk to people from the community, like community leaders or patient groups, before they even design the study. They need to show who they talked to, what they talked about, and how that feedback changed the study plan. Item B2 goes a step further. It is not just about getting permission from an ethics board to protect individual people. It is about making sure the whole community understands what the research is about, why it is being done, and how the results will be used. And the community should basically say, yes, this is okay and important for us. This is about making sure research isn't just something done to a community, but something done with them. It speaks to something called epistemic justice, which is a big idea about making sure knowledge is created and shared fairly, giving credit and voice to communities. Now, Section C is about how they actually set up the study. Item C1 is super important. It says you must use a standard test to figure out how good someone is in the language you are going to use for the testing. If someone is tested in a language they don't know well, their scores will be lower, and it won't be because their brain works differently, but just because of the language barrier. Item C2 talks about having a good comparison group. If you are studying people with a certain condition, you need to compare them to people who don't have that condition. And crucially, these two groups need to be similar in other ways like age, sex, and education level. This makes sure any differences you see are because of the condition population you are studying, not just because the groups were already different in other ways. Item C3 highlights the need for local norms. Imagine you get a score on a test. How do you know if it is good or bad? You compare it to what is typical for people like you. This item says those typical scores, the norms, should come from the local population, not from somewhere far away. Using norms from a different culture can lead to wrongly saying someone has a problem when they don't, or missing a problem they actually have. Section D focuses on the actual tests. Item D1 stresses following the International Test Commission's guidelines for adapting and translating tests. This is like making sure a recipe is followed carefully so that the cake turns out the same every time, even if you use different ingredients from different places. Item D2 is about back translation. You translate a test one way, then you translate it back into the original language by a different person. If the back translation is very different from what you started with, it means something got lost or changed in the translation process. This item makes sure that process is done carefully and documented. Item D3 says you need to get permission from the people who made the test before you change it or translate it. This is both about being ethical and following copyright rules. Item D4 says you need to test the adapted or translated test to make sure it still works well. This is like test driving a new car before you sell it to lots of people. You check to see if it's reliable and measures what it is supposed to. You either do this testing yourself or cite someone else's reliable research that has already done it. Item D5 talks about tests that measure crystallized intelligence, things like vocabulary or general knowledge. These can be tricky in cross-cultural research because they are very dependent on what you've learned in your specific culture. The checklist suggests these shouldn't be the main tests used, or if they are used, they should be clearly marked as secondary and their limitations noted. Section E is about preparing the people doing the research. Item A requires that everyone who interacts with participants gets real training in cultural competency. This isn't just a quick chat. It means teaching them about their own biases, the culture of the people they're working with, and how to communicate respectfully. Item O says this training needs to be documented, what was covered, how long it was, and who gave it. This shows that the training was serious and not just a formality. Finally, Section F is all about being open and honest when you share your findings. Item F1 means you have to describe exactly how you translated and adapted the tests. This allows other researchers to see if you followed the right steps and if the adaptation is trustworthy. Item F2 insists on reporting important details about the participants that can affect their test scores. This includes things like when they learn the language of the test, how well they can read and write, the quality of their schooling, and whether they have moved around a lot. These aren't just random details, they are crucial for understanding the results. Item F3 is a really powerful one. When researchers talk about differences in how groups perform on tests, they have to consider things like poverty, how good education is, nutrition, and access to healthcare. They can't just blame differences on culture or biology. They need to think about how unfair situations might be affecting performance. This is about understanding the real-world barriers people face. Item F4 suggests that if you've done research in that area before using similar tests, you should compare your new findings to that older data. This helps situate your new findings within the existing knowledge for that community. Item F5 is about avoiding overgeneralization. You can't say something is true for an entire culture based on a small group of people you tested. You have to be very clear that your findings only apply to the specific people you studied and under the conditions you studied them. This is so important to avoid harmful stereotypes. Item F6 is the aspirational one, meaning it's a really good idea but not strictly required for everything. It encourages researchers to share their adapted tests and data openly so others can check their work. If they can't share, they need to clearly explain why. This is part of being transparent and helping science move forward. To show how the checklist works, the authors applied it to 2 real studies. One study, RUBIN'S et al., 2022, did a pretty good job and met most of the accent criteria, especially with how they adapted their tests and reported their findings. The other study, Neuropsychological et al., 2020, the one that was retracted, failed pretty much across the board. This stark comparison clearly shows how following these kinds of guidelines can lead to much more responsible and trustworthy research. The RUBIN'S study, for example, paid attention to the team's background, how they adapted tests using the ITC guidelines, and reported their findings transparently. This meant their work was more robust. On the other hand, the Neuropsychological study missed the mark on having a proper comparison group, didn't properly document test adaptation, and made sweeping claims about a whole population from a tiny sample. Using the accent checklist would have clearly flag these serious issues. Now, the authors are clear that this accent checklist is still in its early stages. It's a proposed framework, and it needs to be tested and validated. They have a plan for this. First, they'll ask a group of international experts to review each item on the checklist and give feedback on how clear, relevant, and complete it is. This is to make sure that the people who really know this field agree with the checklist. Next, they'll have experts rate how well each item actually measures what it is supposed to measure. This is about making sure the checklist is measuring the right things to achieve culturally competent research. They'll also talk to researchers who have actually done this type of work. They'll ask these researchers to go through the checklist and explain what each item means to them. This helps them make sure the checklist is easy to understand and use in the real world. Finally, they plan a simulation study where some researchers will use the checklist to evaluate research scenarios, and others won't. They'll see if using accent actually helps researchers spot more problems in study designs. This is the ultimate test to see if the checklist makes research better. So, what's the big picture here? The accent checklist is like a comprehensive guide that fills in the gaps left by older guidelines. It's not meant to replace them, but to build on them and make them more practical. One of the really cool things about accent is that each item is designed to be quotable. That means you can look at a study and clearly say yes, no, or not applicable to each point. This makes it super useful for journals, ethics boards, and even for researchers themselves to check their own work. The part about community engagement is a real standout. It emphasizes that research shouldn't just be about gathering data, but about genuinely involving and respecting the communities being studied. This is a move towards greater epistemic justice, making sure that the knowledge produced actually benefits and reflects the communities it's about. The authors are upfront about the limitations. The checklist has a strong foundation, but it still needs that formal validation. They're sharing it now to get feedback from the scientific community and to make it available as a reference. They also note that it was heavily influenced by their work in Southern Africa, so they're looking forward to seeing how it applies in other regions as well. They see accent as a living document that will evolve. They plan to create a digital version to make it even easier to use and hope to foster an international group to keep it updated and relevant. In conclusion, the accent checklist is a really important step towards making cross-cultural neuropsychological research more ethical, rigorous, and respectful. It covers the whole research process and pays special attention to working with communities and understanding cultural contexts. While it's still being validated, it's a powerful tool that can help us conduct research that truly serves and represents the diverse populations we study. It's not just about doing good science, it's about doing the right thing. What do you think about this checklist? Would you use it in your own research? Let me know in the comments below, and if you found this breakdown helpful, please give this video a thumbs up. Subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more science stories, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next dive into the fascinating world of psychology. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.